Yeah, colleagues, I will take this opportunity to thank you in behalf of Fulbright Ukraine office. We are waiting for Jessica Zichovich, who will join us in a couple of minutes to welcome you from Warsaw. From my side, I would just mention that we are gathering today to have a live talk with journalists, media experts, radio producer Graham Griffith and Brendan Hoffman. As you probably know, Fulbright can unfortunately host US scholars and US students in Ukraine since 2022, but fortunately many brave US scholars, US students, and just American citizens, they still traveling here and they want to know more about our everyday life. So that's how Graham Griffith today here. He was US scholar to Bulgaria back in 2023. And during the opening of our famous Fulbright Ukraine exhibition, Ukraine War and Resistance, we met there with Graham, and then Graham met with Jessica in Warsaw. And that's how these intersections of Fulbright communities in many other countries, they realized in this event. And Brendan Hoffman is famous photographer, photojournalist. He is author in the New York Times, and also he is one of the authors in our great exhibition I mentioned, Ukraine War and Resistance. If some of you hearing about it for the first time, please let me know after this event. I will tell you a little more, and maybe your institution, your organization would like to host it as well, because its travel and story is huge, and we have even printed copies here in office. They are waiting for future venues. And here is Jessica, and please enjoy our event and stay till the end. At the end, we will have a little refreshments and fun.
Hello, everybody. Vitayu, welcome. Glad to see you. I am here in Warsaw, calling you from there. And I know some of you were also at our office yesterday for another discussion we had about Ukrainian music. That discussion, just like this one, is recorded and will be posted onto our website, so you can check it out later, share it with your colleagues, networks, etc. Also want to note that we have several of our program deadlines still open. There are weeks, even months ahead of the Scholar program, so you have no excuse not to apply or encourage others, students, colleagues of yours to apply. Today, our topic is also following on the theme of cultural diplomacy and exchange of perspectives between the US and Ukraine. It's called, What Can American Journalists Learn from the Ukrainian War Experience? And we have with us two very, very wonderful, extremely experienced Fulbright alumni who are also themselves professional journalists. I would like to just very briefly highlight some facts about their careers without reading verbatim all of the information and all of the publications they have, but you can certainly go to our social media and find more and read their texts and blogs and see their photographs. Graham Griffith is an audio producer and a designer of radio programs and podcasts. He has launched programs like On Point and The Takeaway in the US. As a media strategist, he's worked with civic-minded journalism organizations like International Consortium of Investigative Journalists, the On Being Project, The Conversation, and many of the major market public radio stations in the US, as well as BBC World Service. He helped develop SoundUp, Spotify's global initiative to support underrepresented communities in podcasting. And most importantly, he was a Fulbright U.S. scholar in Sofia, Bulgaria in 2023-2024, and continues to collaborate with independent journalists and civic service organizations throughout Central and Southeast Europe. He also writes a blog thought piece website called Notes from a New Europe, column for Transitions Media, a regional news site based in Prague, so you can check that out. He has also been a distinguished visiting professor at University of Michigan, my alma mater, and Wesleyan University. He's in the process of launching a new model for creative journalism, Effervescence.world, an Effervescence collective based in Portland, Maine. Brendan Hoffman, who's also with us today, is a documentary photographer based in Kyiv, whose work explores themes of identity, history, politics, conflict, and the environment. His photographs from the Revolution of Dignity, War in Donbass, and full-scale invasion of Ukraine have been published in all major media and exhibited in museums, galleries, festivals, and educational institutions, including through our Fulbright War and Resistance photography exhibit, which features several of our U.S. and Ukrainian alumni photographers. He's a frequent contributor to New York Times, where in 2025 he wrote and photographed a front-page feature story on the war's environmental toll. He's covered the intersection of conflict and the environment as a reporting fellow for South Asian Journalists Association, documenting challenges facing India, Pakistan, and China in their shared Indus River Basin amidst climate change, population growth, and political tension. This work also formed the basis for his first National Geographic feature story published in 2020. Hoffman was the winner of the 2018 Philip Jones Griffiths Award for his coverage of Donbass and was a 2018-2019 Fulbright U.S. scholar in Ukraine. The year after I was just 1 year before you in 2017-2018. So we missed each other. All right. Yeah, yes. So without further ado, I turn the floor to first Graham Griffith.
Thank you, Jessica. I mean, first, it's just really a thrill to be here, and it doesn't feel real, and I'm not sure it is. I'm also not sure I'm real, but we're here, and I want to lay some expectations for this. First, I'm a producer, not talent, and it's really dangerous when you've been a radio producer to actually take the microphone, because for 20 years I was doing daily news, sort of long-form news programs in what we call public radio in the U.S. So different from public media elsewhere that I kind of hesitate to say this, but let's call it public service media in the U.S. And so I realized my job was journalism, but also conversational inquiry, more than anything else. When you're the producer, you have to tell the host how to do things differently. You have to prepare them for going on air, and you're in charge of talent, but who can be in charge of talent? So it's a very tricky space to be in, and taking the mic is the worst thing you can do, because then they hear how bad you are at it. So I will not be trying to pretend to be a host. I will try to host this effectively. But I have to do it as a producer. So this might sound tedious, but I'm going to tell you what we're going to do here and how we're approaching this, because we are as much the audience as you are. And so in order to lay the ground rules, I am thinking about time and how we use it. So we have an hour. We will finish at 7:15 Kyiv time. We are going to use a 3-act structure, which for anybody who grew up Istanbul or West is the structure that storytelling was used since we were babies and we don't even know it. If you are not familiar and not as boring as me about breaking things down and reverse engineering why things are the way they are, then I'll just tell you, 3-act structure begins in a place of the known. You establish a space, and I'm going to use probably this works for everybody. I'm going to use Lord of the Rings as an example. You begin in Hobbit Town and you set the scene, you figure out who people are, but what's going on, a lot of furry feet, multiple breakfasts, things like that. So you establish a scene and you're in the space of the known. You also end, the 3rd act is the space of the known, except you've been on a journey and now you're back in Hobbit Town, you've changed, things have changed. the middle in the three-act structure is a messy, messy middle. And I'm a messy person, the way that I work as an independent journalist or whatever you want to call me these days, is I just go into spaces and listen and learn and respond. So we're going to have a messy middle, and the messy middle will be all of us exchanging ideas and asking questions. I have a million questions for Brendan, so if everybody's shy, then that's what we could do. But this is not me interviewing Brendan, even though I'm taking the mic too much at the beginning. So I'm going to establish the scene with just kind of an opening 3-minute lightning talk that might not look like it relates to Ukraine and Kyiv in particular, and yet has everything to do about Kyiv. I used to say that I was a journalist, and I'm not sure that I want to say that anymore. Part of it is, I think that a lot of people, at least in the US context, who call themselves journalists, I say this with love, and you can weigh in, Brendan, later, are not committing acts of journalism. And so I've just decided, what if there is no journalism and we focus on what we're doing? Now, the reason this ties to Kyiv is there's somebody whose picture is not up on the screen there, but it's joining us from Portland, Maine. I came in here in 2017, and I did commit acts of journalism while here. I really came as what my Neapolitan cousins call a chucho. It's like a pack mule, because my wife had written a book on creativity and museum practice, and it was translated into Ukrainian, and she was invited with her co-author, Linda Norris, a former Fulbright Ukraine person as well, to travel the country and talk about how museums can serve the general public more effectively by being creative in how they do these things. So I got to come to Kyiv. I had a client at the time named ICIJ, International Consortium of Investigative Journalists. They had put out the Panama Papers the year before. So it's the 10th anniversary of the Panama Papers. I think the single biggest global investigation that we've seen. And I got to Kyiv thinking, here we are in a country that's been at war for 3 years. There's not going to be anything going on in Kyiv. Why would people invest in the future in a country when you don't know what the future is? I land and I'm talking to people journalists from around the world who had come to Kyiv because they were safe here after participating in the Panama Papers, and they were not safe elsewhere. So first, this is not Kansas. And the other thing that happened is, don't judge, I'm not a big drinker, but I really find creative atmosphere in craft beer places and coffee shops. And in 2017, June of 2017, there were so many new craft beer bars here in Kyiv, and I would talk to the owner, and they had opened 2 months before, 3 months before, 2 weeks before, and new coffee shops. A city or a country that from afar to the world, to the people who were paying attention, looked like a place that had an uncertain future, had creative people creating new things. So the theme of today is, what have we learned? And I'll come back to why that theme came to me and is part of an ongoing investigation, I would call it. But I'll just start with one of the things I learned in 2017 is that move forward, Ukrainians are showing us how to create new things with incredible constraints. So, journalism. What is journalism? So, as I think about my practice moving forward, I'm trying to explore how we commit acts of journalism without even calling them journalism. So I've been talking to some really interesting people in other fields to say, okay, there is no journalism. What am I doing for the world? And so I started to think, so what are other occupations that are doing things that would be like what journalists might do? And so I'm just you have 90 seconds more of me, and then we'll get into the conversation. But for example, if we're not journalists, what if we are meteorologists? So I spoke to a really wonderful meteorologist in Portland, Maine. Her name is Nola. And I said, Nola, how do how do meteorologists help the public? And it's like, well, you tell people if it might rain, you bring out an umbrella. So you tell people ahead of the day, how do you prepare for the world? Get ready by having the tools that you might need, not the tools that you necessarily need, but what you might need. But what if we are teachers? What if we act like teachers thinking, and this is a great teacher in Boston named Maggie, a teacher gives people the tools to make sense of the world. Teaching is not about facts and memorization, it's about preparing you to be curious. What if we are street artists taking gray spaces in the middle of a city and making them beautiful and provocative through storytelling? What if we are chefs? Instead of just saying, I need to give you food, how about I make you a meal that has nutrients, but you want to come back to it and you'll feel, because you feel better and it's exciting and creative. This is my personal chef in Sofia named Elliot. He's really quite talented. Sometimes we just need to take a rest because the world is so much, too much. What if we are civic leaders? And we actually, civic leaders, this is Leslie Knope from the documentary Parks and Recreation. And civic leaders decide, okay, we need to build new parks. How do we do that? What if we're members of a team and you're in collaboration? Ukrainians understand this and are demonstrating this. You don't do everything. You have your role to play, and it's in partnership with people. What if we're pilots helping people navigate through from point A to point B? What if we are gardeners and landscapers creating beautiful spaces, because we all deserve beautiful spaces in the real world and in what's becoming the real world, digital spaces. Sometimes religion's okay, so, what does a nun do to help people calm down? And sometimes you need a beer. What if we're engineers designing the next great tools to make the world a better place? Sometimes we just read because we need to understand, so that when we need to find out what's coming next, we look to the past. Sometimes we just need to listen. Sometimes we dream, whether it's of T-bone steaks or a better world. What if we are musicians, helping people prepare for the world by calming them, soothing them, opening up their curiosity through music? What if we're scientists trying to solve the biggest problems? And most importantly, what if we, and this is for you, Fiona, because this leads me to your work, but what if we're epidemiologists, like Nathaniel Raymond? That's somebody who I've been trying to engage with a lot. But what if instead of just saying there are problems, we see problems, say, how did we get here? Where did this develop? How does this travel? In order to do that, we figure out how to explain to people where we might be able to go. So I'm going to end this here, sort of kind of where do we start? As a journalist, where do I start first? I got to measure what's happening, though I got to measure it differently, not through sorting people into outdated models of left and right mean nothing anymore. But we also have to tell captivating stories, and we have to tell them honestly. And I won't go into this science, but we have to be in community. So if we're not journalists, we have all sorts of other tools to help us understand how to commit acts of journalism and to help people make sense of the world. So that's the opening gambit in order for everybody to be sort of in a place of where I come from. What I'm trying to do right now is figure out what's next for sense making for the world. And I'll pause and hand it over to Brendan. For me, part of this practice is learning and sharing what we can learn from the behavior of Ukrainians, what Ukrainians have done since 2014, and even more since 2022. And that will be our conversation, not lecture, tonight. So thank you for joining, and now you have a sense of who I am and how I come to you before we start to engage.
Thank you so much for organizing this. I think it's very cool to do these sort of like collaborations and cross-fertilizations between different Fulbrights in different countries. I don't know how often that happens, but it feels like it ought to happen a lot more. Like I remember in my experience, it felt very like Ukraine was Ukraine. This is what you focused on. I don't think that we had a lot of exchange with other Fulbright cohorts at the same time. So it's something to think about, it's something cool to do. I don't have like a prepared presentation to talk about any of this stuff. That is an amazing way to think about journalism, though. All of those incredible examples. You know, being a meteorologist, like imagine if people couldn't just look out the window and know what the weather is, right? Like we have to go be detectives and figure out, is it raining or not? And you have to, you know, call your sources and, you know, maybe do a stakeout. Did the raindrop just come down? Was that rain? Like, how do we know it's rain? We need another source. It's you know, it's pretty basic. Like doing journalism is very basic. Anyone can do it. It does not require superpowers or really like, well, maybe it's not true to say it doesn't require special skills. I think we're moving into a phase of journalism where people do need to have some really concrete skills in thinking of someone who is skilled in doing open source intelligence, someone who's skilled in interpreting satellite data and remote sensing and all of these things that are becoming more and more important. And I myself am like starting to go down that path because this is a perfect example. The situation in Ukraine, it is extremely difficult to report from the front line here, and particularly as a photographer, right? Like you can't take pictures unless you're close, and it's extremely difficult and extremely dangerous to be close. So if we want to know what's happening, but we can't actually go there, then you start leaning on these other tools.
That's really, that's, you know, I mean, if I can
Please
steer us in the conversation too, like you know, it's interesting thinking about how we have two, well, you have a literal lens, but like this sort of collaboration of the people who are from afar and the people who are up close and the people who are in the middle, like this, I feel like we haven't been doing this very well in the journalism field. But let's talk more, you know, more broadly. This we only just met. I know your work really well, and we just had a little bit of a conversation before this. And you know, it's a real gift for me to be able to ask people who are looking at things from up close while I was watching from afar, and recognizing that there are actually things that somebody who's, if we take it even more broadly, like context and detail. And the best storytelling is granular detail that leads to something that is within a broader context. And so in some ways, our work is in collaboration, even though we haven't collaborated, because you are trying to present to people, I don't want to say the truth, because that's a whole other lecture, but you're trying to give people access to something they can't get to, and I'm trying to frame what we're seeing around the world and create connections to what's happening in Ukraine, to what's happening, you know, in my city of Portland, Maine, when we had enhanced ICE activity, and then what's happening in Argentina, because they are all of a piece and they're all connected at this point. But why don't you, for people who don't know, you came in 2013 to the region. You were in Moscow.
Initially, yeah.
I mean, tell us, so you went to Maidan and now you have not gone back to I mean, you've gone back to the US, but you've decided to stay here.
Yeah, well, just by way of background, right. So I happened to relocate to Moscow in mid-2013. So when Maidan kicked off here, I was near enough that it was easy and sort of logical for me to come. I had spent, prior to that, my career was in Washington, D.C. And quite honestly, I came because I thought, oh, I photographed lots of protests in Washington, D.C. Like that's a thing I can do. I can go do that well, which is how I got here initially, and was obviously captivated. I was all of you are old enough to remember how unique that moment was, but it was also such a bizarre feeling to see that sort of hopeful thing also take such a dark turn and transform from a protest really into a war, like right underneath everyone's feet. And that, of course, was also compelling and led me to stick around for the following 12 years. And here I am still. And to me, that's something that we need to think about more is the way that moment when, and there is no clean line to define when a war becomes a war usually. I mean, February 24th was a pretty bright line, but the 8 years before that were anything but a bright line, right? That was an extremely sort of slippery period of time when it was a war, it wasn't a war, it was a war in some places, it wasn't a war in other places, and I don't think people who've never been in that experience understand what that signifies. And so for American journalists, American audiences, for everybody outside of that experience, like, needs to sort of take that into consideration. That, you know, as I was telling you before we started this downstairs when we were speaking, like it feels difficult to sort of have this conversation without it either obliquely or directly referencing sort of current political moment in the United States and what that means in terms of why would American journalists need to learn some lessons from Ukrainians. I don't think I need to spell it out, but there's a lot going on. Like, my mind immediately goes to like the ICE raids, immigration enforcement raids that have been taking place. Like, most famously perhaps in Minneapolis, but as Graham pointed out, certainly not only in Minneapolis. It's been in a lot of places, including your hometown.
Yeah, we had in the winter. I think so. First of all, we jump in at any point. I kind of want to take one thing you said though and link it to how this theme came about, for me at least, and why we're all stuck here in this question about what have we learned. Because I think it might be interesting for people who are from Ukraine and in Ukraine. Last September, I finally made it to the Baltics, and part of the reason I wanted to make it to the Baltics is my first full year in Bulgaria. I kept thinking, okay, maybe it was funny that we had a politician, we don't need to name names, confuse Balkans and the Baltics. And usually people Americans will do this, and some of it will just be a slip of the tongue, but rarely does somebody double down when they make that mistake. In any case, we had, people were talking about people in Bulgaria were talking about lots of things and I realized that, okay, the Balkans are in some ways the testing ground for a lot of things on dis and misinformation. And then the Baltics are the place where a lot of dis and misinformation happens, but not as effective. And so when we talk about this idea of when does a war begin and all of that, like the Lithuanians and Latvians in particular in 2007 were sharing with the world what might come. And we don't have to get into geopolitics here, but with what was happening in South Ossetia in Georgia, they were speaking out about it, and it's not necessarily their neighborhood. And so being in one place that has a very kind of careful, maybe cynical approach. I mean, the best experts on dis and misinformation are in Bulgaria. There are many throughout the region. But the action towards it is really very careful. And the Baltics haven't been careful. So I had a chance, anywhere somebody will give me a free place to stay for, I'm a subsistence farmer of information. So anytime somebody says, hey, we've got an apartment open for a few weeks, and you want to come here? So I set up in Riga for a little while, and I got to go to the Riga conference, which is a big conference. And it's very funny because it's a lot of high level people and defense people. And so you should not show up at that conference with 10 minutes before it starts, because the security is not only complicated because it's detailed, it's also complicated by every fourth person in line thinks that they don't have to wait in the line because it's in many accents, you hear it in English, do you know who I am? And so you have, and to make matters worse, it was one of those revolving doors, and I have a worry brain, which is, part of why I'm a journalist, I think, and I couldn't take my eyes off of the disaster that was going to happen with some ambassador getting stuck in a revolving door. But so it's a fascinating conference, and to their credit, they invited a Ukrainian artist. They gave him 15 minutes on stage. And he, on stage, to me, looked like he wanted to be there, but was not so sure about the questions he was asked. So at lunch with him, I made sure to sort of sit with him, and I asked him what was going on. And he did say this on stage, but he said it even more forcefully at lunch. He said, I'm tired of talking about resilience, tired of talking about how hard things are, and I don't want to be on stage as an example of pain and suffering and strength. I'm an artist, I want to be on stage for my art. And so I said, if you were hosting a conference and you as artists were inviting people from diplomats and ambassadors and journalists, what would you call it? What's the question you would ask? And he said, Gigi, I would say, what the F? What the F, I mean, he used a different word, but what the F have you learned? It's been 4 years. Enough time to get a college degree. So stop asking us how we're doing it. Tell me, what have you learned? So you have fallen into our trap and come to a conversation about what have we learned. So anybody who's not a Ukrainian in here, I would love for you to chime in on this. I will start by saying what I have learned, and let Brendan share some of that, and then let's get into a conversation about this. So one of the things that I've learned is that hope is a hard power. I've been for 11 months now trying to talk to people about the fate of Ukrainian children and asking the question, what are we going to do about this? Why don't we care? And sharing some information that I've had I've gathered people. We do conversation with people in Ukraine, people who are trying to track this, and none of this is with fiscal or journalistic sponsor. It's just a conversation that needs to happen between South Sudan and here. And I am far from the expert on this. We have a great expert in the room on this, but I'm far from the expert on this. But I'm just asking people, so what's going on? Why aren't we talking about this? And I have started to talk to behavioral scientists saying the same question, because in my practice, one of the rules is there are no rhetorical questions. So if I think a rhetorical question, the way I'm wired, I have to find a way to answer it. I may not make the conversation totally boring by asking somebody to answer it with me. I might. But so this has become this question, okay, why don't we care? Because if I can't make people care about the fate of children as intentional victims of war crimes, how can I make them care about policy decisions in their city that are very important? How can I make them care about what a school board does and all of that? And so in these conversations, back to hope, I find that I'm talking to Ukrainians and we're using all of the emotions. There's jokes. I mean, the memes are all over the place. Like, the creativity is constant, and it is not taking away from the seriousness of the topic. And I talk to Americans, and it's some form of zombie or Charlie Brown adult, like, yeah, and it's just, there's something going on in our operating system. And so in talking to a woman named Laurie Santos, who's an expert on happiness, asking her, Laurie, what's going on here? I feel like there's happiness here and there's no happiness here. And these are people who are upset about political moves, but they've kind of got everything that they need. And she reminded me of, okay, maybe happiness might not be the word that people can access on this, but hope is. And so the hard power of hope is one of the most important things I've learned from work with Ukrainians and in watching what has happened in Ukraine. Even people who might reject the word because it seems soft, there is a reminder that in all times, if you're moving forward both defensively and proactively, hope is an essential trait. So that's one of the things I've learned. So now's the point where we can share some of those things. But Brendan, do you want something you have in
Hope
mind?
was strong enough to get Barack Obama elected president. That is and was a powerful sentiment. I don't know if my answer to your question is as concrete, but in my entire experience here, more than anything else, the one sort of like big question that remains in the back of my mind is, as I understand kind of the Ukrainian perspective on this, is the war here is, in a very real way, a consequence of the failure of Russians to have dealt with their autocratic situation over the past 25 years. This was not something anybody here asked for or wanted. It's something that happened to Ukraine. And a lot of that blame in the Ukrainian mind lies within Russia. Why did you guys there allow your leader to take you to a place like this? Which I think is a completely fair question to have. But sitting here as an American, watching difficult things take place in the United States, it raises pretty uncomfortable questions about, all right, so what is my responsibility in that context? What is the responsibility of everybody in that context? And it's very easy sometimes as a journalist to sort of remove yourself out of that situation. It's almost become a knee-jerk reaction, and it's taboo to sort of even insinuate that you have an opinion on things, let alone that you like are actively hoping for a particular outcome in any political debate or those types of electoral questions. Like, you're not supposed to have opinions as a journalist, but clearly that is a ridiculous idea. I think in Ukraine, the Ukrainian journalists covering this war have, maybe this is not pioneering a new model, but they've really kind of done a bang-up job of exemplifying what it is to do real, impactful journalism, like honest journalism. But at the same time, it's coming from a really particular perspective. This is not some like fake neutrality thing. They have a very strong perspective. That does not mean that they can't do really strong journalism here. And so, like, what is my job? What is my role as a journalist, as an American? Are those two things in conflict? Are they the same thing? Is the fact that I've been living overseas for more than a decade, like, do I get a pass? Like, I don't know the answer, but this is a big question in the back of my mind. Now you want everybody else to.
I was doing the awkward silence, like being comfortable awkward silence and saying, I don't know anybody here well enough to call on them, though I did meet a future Fulbrighter a couple of days. Okay, go. Yeah.
I think we've learned about the strength of soft power in two ways. I think Ukrainians have really shed a light on the strength of civil society organizations, which have swung into action, right? Mobilized really quickly in all kinds of ways to fill gaps, but also to invent some new supports that maybe weren't there. Ukrainians get things done really quickly. First of all, you all don't need like 6 months to think about a committee and then maybe come back with an idea a year later, but just like things work, things move forward. And I think that speaks volumes about social cohesion and maybe what we can learn back in the United States about that. But then the flip side is that Russia exploits soft power, and culture is a really good example of this. And we just collectively need, outside of Ukraine, to do more about that. Not to think about it or theorize it, but like actually to shut it down and break those ties. So that's what I would add to this discussion. Thanks.
Okay, I think everyone is hesitant to speak up because we are actually all Ukrainians.
Yeah,
So the question is not,
yeah.
I'm gonna play the ethnic card because I'm an ethnic Georgian, but I'm a Ukrainian, born here, raised here. I spent enough time around the European investor global policymaking crowd, specifically on education and recently on data science and on AI, to know what they tell me, what they've learned about Ukraine. I know for a fact what they've learned when they ask me, I want to tell them, there are also lots of events that they ask us to speak about the resilience and the resistance and everything. And I know for a fact that they are taken away now. And I mean, institutions like the European Commission, UNESCO, United Nations, but that sort of crowd. I know that they are taken away now, not only the resilience part of it, like not the Vive la Resistance and the barricades around Kiev, that we are past over that hill, essentially. They're taken away, especially with drone alerts all around Europe, with drones flying over the Baltic states. People are actually being drilled into evacuation. They are learning they're not only learning resilience from us, they're learning persistence, how to perpetuate everything, the society, the institutions, the education, how to go on when your first response is flight, freeze, or not fight, freeze or flight. So your first response is to grab everything and run, or to freeze in space, curl in a ball, and never leave the safe spot ever again till the threat passes. So they're learning from us how we actually do that. I will look out the window, see what's flying past, kind of curse it, and then go on.
Mm-hmm.
And then go do the job and meet the deadlines and get the job done. And get the I'm an educator, so get the education going. How that's happening. And we're still, having people with degrees, and we're still having a society because of that. And we're still having a civilization because of that. How we're not disintegrating. We're not a vagabond state. We are not a state of highbrow refugees. We are a country, a functional society. So yeah, that would be my guess, that they're learning that mostly. Yeah. Sustainability under perpetual threat.
I love that, yeah. I find this one of the most challenging and also most sort of like fascinating tasks as a journalist, is to try and communicate this like extremely nuanced like duality of, there's a very real war. It's going on every day. I mean, was an hour and a half ago there were drones flying through the center of Kiev, right? But here we are having this event that I think would blow the minds of almost anyone west of Lviv, right? Like the way that you, like you said, persist even in the midst of all this, and how do you communicate what that experience is like and what's necessary to do that, and sort of the real matter-of-fact nuts and bolts of it sometimes. I don't think people who've never had the experience of conflict, I don't think people get that or can even wrap their heads around it. It's a challenging thing to explain. Like, I tell my relatives that, like, there are new restaurants open in Kiev all the time. Like, that's not at all what they expect to find here.
That's way in the back. I forgot your name, but Jackie, journalist as well.
Yeah. So I'm new to Kiev. It's my first time here. I've been here for 3 weeks. I'm loving it so far. And I'm really here also. I'm a journalist. I work only amongst Ukrainian journalists, so I'm the sole American on my team. And so I'm literally here soaking up like the lessons of Ukrainian journalism, which is why this is like the perfect thing for me to be at. And I think one thing that I've noticed, I've been working with this team for longer than the time I've been here. And one thing I've noticed is that, like, back in the U.S. before I was here, I was bopping around between local papers. So I was doing like watchdog government reporting at like really local papers where everyone really cared. The 200 readers we had really, really cared about what we were writing about, right? And now there's this kind of added layer to the journalism that I see our publication doing, which is how do we tell the stories that need to be told and ask the questions that need to be asked, but then there's an added layer of also, how do we get the world to keep caring? And like that informs everything we do, which is something that I think in the US, I guess I had the privilege of not thinking so desperately about. Also, that's the nature of working at a small independent publication here where we need subscribers, and like having people care is part of the business, right? But it's also part of like the fight here in Ukraine is how do we get the world to continue to read about, care about, ask questions about Ukraine. And so every story is not just a pursuit of an answer to a question, but then a pursuit of a larger question of, why would someone in Ohio care about this, and why should they care about this, and how can we compel them to care about this? And those, like, the creativity with which the Ukrainian team approaches those questions just so innately is something that I'm learning a lot about. Every story is just so much more multifaceted because it's this pursuit, we're covering the war specifically, and it's a pursuit of something so much more complicated than a question, because it's the pursuit of, it's almost like global watchdog journalism, like making sure that the world has its eyes on something so important, even after, 4 years of full-scale invasion and, like you said, many more years of war. So that's just something I've been learning, is that approach.
I mean, the word creativity comes through in a lot of ways too, right? And this is Ukraine could and should be the exporter of creative problem solving. But you had a question.
Oh, can I jump in?
Yeah.
Because one thing that came up when I was thinking about this was like the just sort of like, as a journalist, we often imagine that the best audience is the biggest audience, right? But as you said, you worked in local media, which I've dabbled in because I love the idea that the most important audience for a story might be 200 people in Ohio. It's not, the front page of the New York Times. Like, the best place for that story may be somewhere else. And so it sounds like perhaps the team you're working with now is thinking not just about the generic, how do we get people to care, but maybe a little bit more specifically, or I mean, this may be a question, is it intentional in some way about like, well, we really need Americans to care, we really need people in France, like China, what, like, do you guys think about audiences in a more nuanced way because of the kind of either larger geopolitical considerations, or what's your approach?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, our publication is subscriber funded. Like, it's based on Substack, which means that basically every dollar we get is from a subscriber willing to pay for the publication, no ads, no sponsor, So that inherently changes the method of what we're doing, because not only do people need to care, but they need to care enough to pay for us over another publication. And that's kind of a moral conflict I have. Like, the business of journalism always screws me up a little bit, because like, if I'm in pursuit of the truth, but then there's also a financial model behind this, how do I reckon with those two things, That really complicates me, and like, I wrestle with that a lot. But I think that our specific publication really focuses on a US audience. It's the publication at large, its kind of mission is to tell the human stories of people fighting authoritarianism. So we have, reporters also in Taiwan, and we had some reporters in Venezuela recently, and it's a kind of larger story about, fight for democracy against authoritarianism. And that compels an American audience, but also I think is most important right now for the American audience for the reasons you said, is like, should we be covering the US in the same exact way? Is a question that I think about a lot. So yeah, we do think about audience a lot.
The Kyiv Independent has been a real gift in trying to help Americans understand the complexities of the stories here. And every time somebody throws in something that I think is disinfo related, we have no idea in the US between the commercial forces and external authoritarian forces, the extent to which the framings are, let's just say, off. And so being able to turn somebody to, let's say, yesterday, right? May 20th was yesterday. Anybody able to hold on to dates? 7 years Zelensky being in charge. And so when people throw out these comments about, but isn't he this or isn't he that, to be able to point to the Kyiv Independent and show nuanced coverage, is so much more valuable to me than to try to explain the complexities of it. Internally, there is a much more honest conversation about what's happening. Whatever you think of anybody, the narratives have been complicated in Ukrainian media. So when people try to project this both sidesism nonsense, to get out of the academic space and just say, just read this. This is what people are saying. Sorry, so you wanted to.
Yeah, I was gonna add, so I've been living here approximately a year and a half. I was born and raised in Colombia in the 1980s and 1990s, and that's just to put people in context. So like what I grew up in, and just that there's a lot of conflict. So I've come here with different backgrounds. And my main story here is I'm following the South American women that are in the front line. So that's just put you kind of like, what have I learned from the Ukrainians? For me, it's been, and I speak a lot about this with the other South Americans. It's more kind of like, what have we found in the Ukrainians that are like us, or like myself? But I'm going to talk about us, very general Colombian culture and context, and it's the small things. It's I don't know, that last week with a horrible missile that landed here in Kyiv, or any time that I cover any attack the next day, I just see how everyone comes together, and it's what Fiona was also saying, to clean up, to help, to the tea, there's put the plastic on the window and do this and do that, and you come the next day and it's even more, and then you go back you come back. I've gone through places where they told me like, oh, in 2022 there was a hole here because I missile hit, and so you were standing where that was. So I think it's that it's just for me as a Colombian, because I think then again for us Colombians it wouldn't necessarily be so clean cut and not beautifully, but so organized. And the other thing that I think that we found in common with the Ukrainians is, well, no matter what, you just keep on going, because we also have it's not like the history here, but we also have a very violent history. And we share our food. People are welcoming to your home. People will invite you. People will, share whatever the piece of bread, or they'll have some tea for you. So I think it's that. I don't know what word to use. It's not
Community.
Yeah. No matter what, here we are all together. It doesn't matter who you are, where you come from, whatever your story is. Like, we're all here. And going back to like the geopolitical and why do we care, I've been trying to, for me it's extremely interesting to see how the Colombian, and how this is affecting Colombia, but also how Colombia has been supporting Ukraine in many ways. And it goes not only by people coming here and fighting, but there's, and I could like talk about it forever. But it's it's also it's a different way. It's for me at least. It's a little bit less black and white about what I've learned.
Yeah. Well, thank you.
This community civil society thing has come up a couple of times. And I kind of going back to the sort of main premise here, like I don't think that's something that's going to be foreign to Americans. Like I think back to, was it Hurricane Katrina, or was it something more recent when there was, they called it the Cajun Navy, that was like a bunch of guys with boats just out, like self-organized. I have a boat, I'm gonna go and I'm gonna like help rescue people, and they kind of grew into a little bit of an organization. But I'm worried that from a media standpoint, that got covered as like a quirky thing.
Yeah.
And they got christened with this kind of quirky name, and it's just like, oh, isn't that a cute little story? But in a context like Ukraine, or I guess Colombia, or maybe even the United States of 2026, it's not cute and quirky so much as it is like super fundamental and vital. And like that is not just a fun little story, it's like actually really important information, like nuts. How did this happen? How does it work? How can this be replicated? Because as we've seen in Ukraine, like there are existing organizations, but so much of it has just been, like organically in the last 4 years. It's not relying on institutions that were here previously. Like so much of what's happened in the last, since the full-scale invasion is new, and people like learning how to effectively do this stuff themselves.
I think it had not crossed my mind to think about that period, but one of the things that I did is a deep analysis of crisis journalism during the first decade in the U.S. And we failed the American public as journalists. I was trying to figure out what happened. So I will just build on Katrina, because it is this is amazing thinking about, this is why we have these conversations, because we don't know where we're going, but to be able to create the connections between Colombia and the US at different times, but journalism in particular, Katrina's a really important example because what we did in American journalism wasn't us and them. So Katrina, for most Americans, and you know, I should also say, I have a client, people I work with at an organization called Embrace Race, and I intentionally carried this around, especially in Bulgaria and Eastern Europe, so that people are like, wait a second, the nuances around race. These things, what Embrace Race is doing, which is about children racial learning in the US, is very much tied to what is happening with Kremlin hybrid warfare, all of these things. So they're all connected, but what happened in Katrina, the short version of it is, we, US journalists, treated it as an event that happened to them. And so that's why the disinformation and that was you ask Americans about the Superdome in New Orleans, and they have this false story about looting and crime instead of a story that Ukrainians completely appreciate. If you go over, thanks to Maria, I was Chris Grant and I were over at the World War II Museum, and you go into that basement and you see what, you feel the survival necessity tactics of community in a space that was impossible. And it's a story of community, whereas in the American context, because of race, we treat something like something happened that didn't happen, and still that is codified into history in the US as something. So there is a way in which in our own country we have, to what kind of connects to something you were saying before, it's something that happens to them, not us. But so thank you for that. And Chris Grant,
yeah.
Right, Grant, because you have for years, since you were a Fulbright scholar here and weren't here for very long because it was 2022, right? From what I think you were telling me before, you're having this kind of conversation with US college students in Georgia all the time.
Sure. I guess the lesson I've learned, and staying on, but it really, you've said it already. Rio was very generous to organize an event for me to speak at the university here today. And so I stood up through my first air raid siren, and I followed what my Ukrainian friends are doing, Ukrainian people on the street are doing, and the student sheepishly looked at me and said, "You ignored it." And I said, yeah, I watched it, you ignored it, and people continued on about their day-to-day lives. I stayed close to the door so that I could get down to the basement if I needed to, because this is my first air raid siren. But I ignored it. And yes, I understand that we should not always ignore air raid sirens, but Ukrainians know when to ignore it and when not to. I don't. And I learned this. Ignore the things, yes, you have to be cautious. Of course you do. But my university doesn't want me to give me any reason to be in Ukraine officially. I have no money from them, et cetera, et cetera. So I've been releasing shorts on YouTube. So I figured that's out of the bag. Somebody's going to say, what the expletive did you do in authorizing this travel? I want everybody to know this is not authorized travel. So the president, chief assistant, and the administration of the university, all the way down the pike covering and saying, I'm here as a citizen, I didn't ask permission, I know that the university doesn't condone my travel to Ukraine, but I did it on my own. Fulbright Ukraine is not responsible for bringing me here, the US government's not responsible for all of this. But really, it is kind of just ignore all of that. There are people here who are real, and they're very resilient, can be overplayed, but they're living through what they have to live through. They put one foot in front of each other, and I think that's a very admirable thing to do. And yeah, I talk about this in the United States quite a lot. I was a Fulbright scholar in Ukraine in 2022. I got to enjoy the experience of being evacuated by the State Department, which was a very enjoyable experience. The way people in the States, journalists wanted to talk about it, I was carrying my 12-year-old daughter on my back across the frozen steppes of Ukraine. We evacuated in business class because I needed the extra allowance for the luggage. I mean, it wasn't an unpleasant thing from a physical experience. It was emotionally disruptive, but in a physical sense, it wasn't that difficult. And I realized that we have built this into this enormous thing that people just continue living. And that's really very noble and heroic in ways that we don't always think of it being. And no, I don't feel like my life is in danger because I came to Kyiv right now. There are times when I would not like to be in Kyiv in the recent past, but right now I feel perfectly safe.
Sun is still.
Can I?
Yeah.
Well, I would like to ask you both as meteorologists. Just my question is about the climate. We all feel that the climate literally has changed for just 10 years maybe. Well, what about the emotional climate, psychological climate? What can you say about the climate in Ukraine and outside Ukraine? Is the climate outside Ukraine less empathetic towards Ukraine, more empathetic, or people are tired of Ukraine? As sometimes we do have some waves of fatigue, as they say. And maybe some prognostication about what the climate might be.
Yeah.
I would think people outside of Ukraine who are feeling tired of it, it may be more than anything a function of us as journalists telling the same stories in the same way over and over again, because obviously these things, drones crash into apartment buildings on a daily basis. Like, we could go just do that story every week if we wanted to. I'm not sure that it has the effect that we imagine. In fact, it can be counterproductive if you're just sort of hitting people over the head with the same depressing stuff all the time. I think that we as journalists have to be better on that front. I don't know if I need to say much about the climate in Ukraine, because almost all of you are gonna feel it at least as much as I do.
I think in a way, we have just a few minutes left. Did you want to say?
I want to ask.
Okay, we add time to this?
Question, just question, not about time, no about.
Okay.
Yes, thank you. I'm really have some pleasure to hear your questions, your conversation and questions and feedback from audience. But at the same time, just one tricky question in my mind, and I can't not to ask it. So when American journalists potential works with some controversial topic, and to be a truth journalist, he needs to cover it from many sides, and we here sitting and know that Ukrainians are great, brave, and so on. We have really a lot of positive sides in our society, and we grew for resistance and so, but at the same time we are not ideal, obviously. We have too many, stories that we are not proud of. And how to deal, and are you dealing with these contradictions when you need to cover stories about Ukrainians that are not so promising, not so supportive in case of finding new supporters in US. So if you know that this topic will damage to Ukraine's support in US, will you cover it or you will ignore it?
Yeah, I think yes, and the thing, and this ties to your comments as well, and I can only speak for myself, but I feel very strongly about this. My conversations with people who have spent time here and are here, everything is on the table, and you can sit in disagreement and learn, and I don't have to, I can feed back that I don't quite see things the same way as somebody else, and we don't get thrust into what happens in other places, which is political punditry. It can be a real conversation. I really, I do not want to have conversations with people who use what I would call reductionism. The left and the right are the worst, but also in a US context, blue and red, liberal, conservative. These are words that were developed in the 19th century and don't mean what they meant then. More importantly, you use this word and different people hear it different way. I've done this surveys just to check my own anger on this. And it does have to do with psychology. And so really, first, the world is not flat and it's not round, it's a sphere. So there is no both sides. You know, plate tectonics are not, there's no point where two continental forces came at each other like this. Everything's like this. And so this falls into the context of what have I learned from and with Ukrainians, is that get to the nuance early and often, because it's going to matter at some point, and you'll waste all your time if you simplify for the moment, and then 10 years later, or 10 months later, or 10 days later, you're talking about something where you wasted this first conversation. And so there is an element here of holding, you know, cognitive dissonance is a bad thing, but it also points to a strange thing in our brains, which we are able to hold multiple truths at the same time. That is a disaster for if we prey upon that, which, you know, advertisers need to prey upon that, so Americans can relate to. Like, I was talking to somebody today about doing a quick survey of how often Wirecutter at the New York Times tells Americans, now it's time, now there's really a water bottle that you need. It's like every 6 to 8 months, there's another thing about, oh my God, you wouldn't believe this water bottle, this is the best water bottle. And I kind of want the comedians to come in here and just do a show about what people did just 10 years ago when there were no reportings on water bottles. Like, oh my gosh, how did people get water when they didn't have a $65 water bottle, right? So being able to recognize like these sort of distractions, but to your question about psychology, it is possible to realize at a moment we have a fire to put out and this is how we put the fire out. And that doesn't mean you trade off the future. The Hungarians showed us this a month ago, and where are the conversations about this, right? The conversation in papers I really respect, like The Guardian, the next morning, after Hungarians did something that even 6 months ago we weren't sure they were going to do, and even 3 days before, we didn't think they were going to get a supermajority. I started to get hints of it when I was there, and somebody said, hey, Gigi, you know that Orban's son-in-law is rapidly getting his money out of the country? Well, that was a sign that it might be a supermajority. But then that night, The Guardian at the top of their page, and I really like The Guardian, the people who work there, said, okay, so Hungarians did this, but what do we know about this guy? And Hungarians weren't sitting in a position of naivete. And I don't feel like most of my conversations with the Ukrainians sit in positions of naivete. So we have conversations about corruption. And Bulgaria, Austria, the U.S. could really learn a lot about how Ukrainians are arguing over what to do about corruption. And you've hit on something that I think could be the next hour, and I promised we'd wrap up. So let's talk over beverages or whatnot. But yeah, I'm so glad you're here, first of all. Thank you. Introduce yourself.
My name is Larissa Babi. I guess the thing that's specific about me is that I'm an American who grew up in the United States, but I've lived in Ukraine for 20 years, including the past 4 or 5 during full-scale invasion. So I really, this is, like the gift and the, how to say it, the thing that keeps me up at night is that I kind of live in both of these worlds at the same time. And yeah, I wanted to jump in before the time is out because it's kind of what when you had asked about what we've learned, the thing that kind of it took me a while to come back to, I learned something very clear about the first year of the full-scale invasion. And that was, this is really happening. And it's something that kind of echoed, comes back as a motif. And it was very powerful, and it was a very powerful driving force. It has to do with mortality, very real material mortality, when you lose people and they don't come back and you can't bring them back, when you lose cities and things that are destroyed, that, building you can rebuild, it will be different, but I think something that Ukrainians learned that Americans haven't is this irreversibility. The things that you can't, and the thing that makes me crazy when speaking with my fellow Americans is that I've seen them, us as a whole, we're still watching. And we're watching what's happening in the United States to us, and it astounds me how, like, the changes that have been happening in the United States for, you know, most dramatically in the past couple of years, but definitely since 2016, 2015, going backwards, and that, I mean, they're alarming, and even if people are maybe enraged and kind of emotionally alarmed about it, it has never, I don't know, I feel like there are pockets maybe that I see in my peripheral vision. There are people, there are communities that are doing things, but I don't get a sense that, like, the larger part of the population is somehow responding to this political situation. So again, I could also talk for an hour, like probably anybody here. But where do I want to get to is sort of this, so like the thing that someone had mentioned, creativity, and I think I've worked a lot with artists, and something that to make like real art, you accept things the way they are. You work with what is actually here. And so even when we talk about Russia, like I think it's very easy for us to wish that it was otherwise, you know, that like we should have, or even, you know, we should have done something. Ukrainians also, we could have done things a lot differently to prepare better. We didn't do those things. And when you're just in the middle of it, like you have to accept that this is it, and then you respond. And that's, you know, you respond in this way, it doesn't work, you respond in a different way. That is creativity. And so like, what do you think as people working in American media, like, I don't know, what are your ideas to get people who don't have Russian missiles falling on their heads every day to get a sense that they are mortal human beings, that you are going to die, if not tomorrow, then in some, you know, that like your time is limited, our time here together is limited, our time in this conversation is limited, like to feel that and let that like move you.
I'll tell you about a little side project that I just did recently, just for myself, because I had this idea for a couple of years, and nowadays the tools exist that me, a poor photographer, can actually do this. Like, I always wanted to build an air raid app for Americans. In real time, when a drone is flying to, say, Kiev, someone in Washington, D.C. gets an alert.
Yeah.
So a drone is flying to Jitomer, somebody in Des Moines gets an alert. And you could see names of cities and towns that are familiar instead of Sumy or whatever, like Konstantinovka, as a way to really bring that home. So you can now vibe code just about anything. So I did make an app that functioned and did this.
Like as in like the drone is headed for Des Moines, or?
Yeah, it would just like, it would like tap into the API from the, like when the alert is on, it would get those actual alerts, and it would pull in like a Telegram channel, and it would translate and like sort of transpose those names. So it would translate it all into English, all those Telegram posts in real time. But if it said Kiev, it would say Washington, D.C., or if it said Lviv, it would say San Francisco. It's so janky, I'm not gonna, like, releasing this publicly, and there's like so many ethical issues around it as well, but like as just an art project, that was like the only,
sense of the way, like.
Yeah, but like I had to go outside the bounds of journalism to find a way to do that,
Yeah, no, that's a conceptual project.
Yeah, it's so I love that and fear at the same time.
That's why it's just sitting.
No, but you know, I'm open to everything at this point, because you know, I think that again, there's rapid iteration here. Now we could argue that it's because it had to happen. Sure, and yet from that rapid iteration, we are seeing things that are possible. We don't, since we're wrapping up, we could talk about fintech and what Americans could learn from Ukrainians in terms of how do you, like the power here, the brain power, the problem-solving power is incredible, right? So there, you know, there might be another, if we're taking the impact of threat and what might happen, I would say, because I'm on this journey with behavioral scientists, where I am asking, if I can't get people to care about children, what should we do differently in journalism? I can say that that's part of why I'm thinking about the natural drugs of storytelling, because the 20 plus year Kremlin strategy has been viral. I don't even use the word propaganda because it's so efficient, because it is just like spread fear in the space. At one point, it was either Radio Sputnik or RT had the motto that is basically like, well, who knows what's true? Question everything, right? And so you put out this notion that, well, who knows what's true? Now that Roger Ailes started that in the US in 1963 with the working the rest strategy of saying liberal media, liberal media, liberal media, and now it's a natural thing. But the Kremlin has made it much more efficient, right? And that is raising cortisol levels, which is bad. But so easy for storytelling, horror films, zombie films, what have you. The flip side of that is raising empathy, dopamine, and storytelling's amazing for that. So you're asking what we're doing, right? And this is a good place for us to land the plane. Like not what are we doing, but also what can we do? What might we do? And it completely ties in with lessons from Ukrainian. So again, people in the fintech space, financial technologies, this is the easiest country to be in the world, to pay bills, to do everything, and with a level of safety, because you actually have government-private relationships that you could not have a community here so trusting of. You don't have paper passports, really. Like, you couldn't do this other places. And that's because you've built a way of the government, the people working together and creating the things that people could have. So the flip side of this might happen to you is actually, you can have nice things. There are things that could be available to you if you thought about community. You thought about addressing inequality. You thought about honest curiosity, and so for me, the work is just being a little bit of I'm in the Don Quixote phase of my. I'm taking lance donations. There are a lot of windmills to tilt at, so if you have any, my lances keep breaking. But I have tried things that are similar to what you did, which is, I try to have Zoom meetings with U.S. journalists and experts in Eastern Europe. And one time, there's this woman named Daria Kuzmina, who is the head at State Watch and Trap Aggressor. And the database they have built that is publicly available on sanctions evasions and who the bad people are. I said, let's get people from U.S. news organizations to just see you, just take us through your database. And then before we went on, I said, Daria, this was a year and a couple months ago, and we had all of this reporting on the ceasefire. I said, Daria, I know from the last week that you have not slept. So let's open this with me saying, how's the ceasefire going, Daria? And she took her camera and said, well, a couple days ago there was a building there, and I'm going to keep my phone on, because this is what we use as Ukrainians with these alert apps. I no longer go to the shelter because I have to go 16 floors down and we don't have any connectivity. So, thank you for the ceasefire. We've never been bombed more. And that was 3 or 4 minutes of the conversation. But to your point, it is just this, this is really happening. This is not a political discourse of who's doing what. And now I think anybody who is on that call, when they hear ceasefire, then ceasefire, that means there's going to be more. That means people in Kyiv are getting bombed. They're getting drones more and more because of the ceasefire. And I think that's a step towards it. I think the other thing, honestly, is the stories here are amazing. And the stories are a fullness of the stories. And I think you do this with your photography. I'm a believer that audio is the best visual format we have. And I, for myself, am just collecting stories where I ask people, so tell me about your day. And one day it's, Gigi, I am operating on 2 hours of sleep because I can't sleep in my bathroom anymore. And the next day it is, to your point and someone else's point, like, I went to this new coffee shop in the neighborhood. Like, let's just get these stories. Let's get 3-minute first-person stories out every day that borrows on the phrase, this is Kyiv, this is Sumy, this is, and some of those cities, there's going to be a lot more. I was on the phone with a journalist from Cordon Media, and in the middle of the Zoom call, there was a quiver, and this journalist said, I'll be right back. And then she got on, and she said, Gigi, I'm going to stay on, but my grandmother's apartment has been robbed. She said, don't worry. Apartment gone. Grandmother, okay. and in an American context, we then feel like we would report that story in sort of a fetishized way of, oh, those poor Ukrainians. And we should feel empathy, except empathy is not patting somebody in the head. Empathy is feeling, right? So this is, the psychology of this is our next conversation, and I really appreciate that. I'm gonna leave it there and let Brendan give his closing comments, and it's great to meet you.
We're gonna land the plane.
Well, okay, so I really appreciate you joining this. We'll migrate this into a conversation with Wine, whoever wants to. Wine without an H for American, W-I-N-E, no W-H-I-N-E, which is another lesson. But thank you for, this is the other lesson. Gathering. We thought we weren't going to have anybody in the room because of a combination of the thunderstorms and maybe air alerts. And you all showed up, and this is the power. This is how we move forward, because humanity has lost its ability to gather as humans, and we have to do it better online. And Jonathan Chang joined us from Seattle, so it's the beginning of his work day, and he's doing daily news radio programs. Rainey Tisdale's the the Queen and Prime Minister of where I live. This is my wife, but I haven't seen her in a while, so it's really delightful. And Jessica for opening it. We have to gather more effectively digitally at this point, and any chance we have. I'm so thankful to Fulbright Ukraine to be here. There's no substitute for getting into a space with people, and normally I would like to listen more. I appreciate you all engaging and listening with me. I'm going to stick around a little bit. We're going to stick around, so thank you all. Appreciate it.
Thank you.